There is an area of continental Europe to the north of Poland and to the south of Lithuania where France and Russia have had a long shared history over the centuries. Sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, there have been many conflicts here. From the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf to the battles of Eylau and Friedland and the Treaties of Tilsit, not to mention the two world wars. Let's discover the reminders of these tragic events. Over the years, the Kaliningrad Oblast region has changed hands several times. It belonged to Prussia, then to Germany, before becoming Russian in 1945. Originally, this area was populated by pagan tribes of Prussians, who made a good living from agriculture, fishing, and the extraction and sale of amber on the coast. This rich and fertile land attracted the envy of its neighbors. In the 13th century, the Prussians went to war against the Teutonic Order, but some of them were forced to withdraw to Russia, led by the opposition leader Glanda Kambila. Legend says that several Russian clans are descended from him, including the Romanovs, who founded the Russian dynasty. The victorious knights of the Teutonic Order built Königsberg Castle in 1255. Königsberg thus became the capital of the duchy and in the 18th century capital of the Kingdom of Prussia, so it has had a turbulent history. On August 30th, 1757, in this field near the village of Gross-Jägersdorf, one of the most famous battles took place of the 7 Years' War, which some historians call the First World War. During this war, Russia and France were allies. In the battle, the Russian army defeated Prussia, and consequently, Prussia became a province of the Russian Empire for 4 years. Following this victory, Königsberg became part of the Russian Empire, and its inhabitants, including the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, founder of critical philosophy and the so-called transcendental idealism doctrine, swore allegiance to the Empress Elizabeth Petrovna, also known as Elizabeth of Russia. Kant is still the most famous citizen of the city of Kaliningrad. 4 years later, the city became Prussian once again. It's said that there is still no proof that Kant ever renounced his Russian allegiance. France may have been Russia's ally in the 18th century during the 7 Years' War, but this was not to be the case in the 19th century. It was here in February 1807, as Napoleon's army pursued the Russians, allies of Prussia, that the Russian general Bennigsen agreed to a confrontation at Eylau on a piece of flat ground suited to cavalry. At dawn, the French infantry led by Marshal Augereau launched an offensive, but a blinding snowstorm threw him off course and his divisions were shot at point-blank range.
Именно в этот момент император обратился к Мюрату. «Ты позволишь этим людям разбить нашу армию?» Мюрат выхватил свою саблю и устремился к французской кавалерии. Он приказал атаковать, выкрикнув всего лишь одну фразу: «Направление задница моего коня!» Он бросился первым в великолепнейшей атаке на русскую армию. За ним последовало около 10 тысяч французской кавалерии, кирасиры, драгуны, гусары, конные гренадеры гвардии.
The battle was very evenly matched, but finally, after a Russian counterattack, it was the arrival of Marshal Ney which was the deciding factor. Ney drafted in 9,000 new troops during the evening, and the Russians decided to retreat. Bennigsen, however, declared to Tsar Alexander that it was a victory. An obelisk commemorates the battle, known to all as the Memorial to the Three Generals. It's dedicated to the brothers-in-arms, the Prussians Lestock and Diericke, and the Russian Bennigsen.
9 февраля, на следующий день после сражения, император посетил поле битвы. Он отдал приказание спасать не только французских раненых солдат, но и русских.
A well-known painting by Antoine Jean Gros, commissioned by Napoleon, depicts this episode. The importance of this battlefield and its symbolic significance for both France and Russia inspired a Russian benefactor to recreate it, starting with a particular landmark which had been turned into a factory during the Soviet era.
Хотелось отметить, что именно рядом с этим зданием находился штаб Наполеона, который наблюдал за сражением при прессе Eylau с колокольни данной кирхи. Подготовлена концепция восстановления кирхи в первозданном виде. Восстановлением прилегающей территории по программе парки малых городов и исторических поселений.
But Napoleon's war here wasn't over yet. The Battle of Friedland followed that of Eylau. While the emperor was still at Eylau, Marshal Lannes was sent as a scout to observe the positions of the retreating enemy troops. The Russians, spying his isolated army corps from the church tower, decided to attack.
Вначале был только корпус маршала Лана, который противостоял всей армии Беннигсена, прибывшей с противоположной стороны реки Алле. Лан сопротивлялся несколько часов, давая Наполеону время собрать все свои силы, чтобы атаковать и сокрушить российскую армию, вытеснив ее к реке. 25 июня два императора встретились на плоту посредине Немана, а 7 июля 1807 года был подписан Тильзитский мир.
Under this treaty, Russia became an ally of France and joined the continental system against Britain. After a few years of peace, Alexander I of Russia's lifting of the continental system, imposed by Napoleon, brought about a new Napoleonic War in 1812, known as the Russian Campaign. The preparations for this great invasion were also carried out in this area, in which notably Marshal Ney resided.
Здесь, в этом замке, находились госпиталь и кавалерия, и конюшни кавалерии. И Наполеон проинспектировал свою армию перед своим походом в Россию.
Unfortunately, this chateau hasn't yet benefited from a restoration program like at Eylau. But if you're feeling magnanimous, Napoleon enthusiasts will be very grateful. In the town center, there are still other reminders of the times when Napoleon's troops passed through.
У каждого памятника как минимум две истории. И у этого русского солдата наполеоновской войны тоже есть свои. Первая, когда и кем он был изготовлен, а вторая народная, черняховская. Вот если девушка незамужняя, удачная, присядет к нему на колено, значит, также удачно она выйдет замуж. И если юноша возьмется за дуло этой винтовки, он благополучно отслужит в армии.
A few kilometers further on are the remains of the chateau of Georgenburg, which was the headquarters of Marshal Davout and his cavalry. At that time, such battles could not be fought without horses, and they needed a lot of them. There is still an equestrian tradition in the area, although not with the same objectives.
Восточная Пруссия, Мюнстербург, у лошадников всего мира имеет особое значение, поскольку именно здесь, в Восточной Пруссии, именно в Мюнстербурге, были выведены знаменитые породы лошадей Тракининская, Гольштинская, Ганноверская. И до сих пор многие лошадники всего мира собираются здесь, в Мюнстербурге, на знаменитые конкуры, чем мы гордимся.
Napoleon's Russian campaign ended with an infamous retreat. During the fighting, one general in particular stood out, mainly because he was the brains behind the scorched earth policy as Napoleon's troops advanced through Russia and during the surrender and the marching of the Russian troops into Paris in 1814.
Калининградская область и все черняховцы гордятся тем, что эта земля связана с именем великого русского полководца Михаила Богдановича Барклая-де-Толли. Именно здесь, в Черняховске, находится единственная парадная конная скульптура в мире этому великому полководцу. И мы гордимся еще тем, что Барклай-де-Толли дважды заходил в Париж и не позволил русской армии ни единого бесчинства на территории Великого Парижа.
Let's leave the 19th century to see which events of the 20th century have also made their mark on the Kaliningrad Oblast. The first battle of the First World War on the Eastern Front took place in eastern Prussia. The Battle of Gumbinnen on the 20th of August 1914. As Winston Churchill declared in an article published in the Daily Telegraph in May 1930, very few have heard of Gumbinnen, and almost no one has attached any value to the important role it played in the victory.
Мы с вами находимся в самом центре Гумбининского сражения. Вот этот мемориал, он находится прямо на месте боев. Здесь 20 августа русские войска разгромили германскую армию и тем самым оказали помощь союзной Франции, оттянув на себя резервы, которых немцам как раз не хватило в сражении на Марне. Здесь шел ожесточенный бой с утра до вечера. Здесь немцы применяли первые броневики, ввели впереди пленных, но русская армия, русский огонь, артиллерия, пехотный огонь остановил противника, и прославленный генерал Маккензен был вынужден бежать с поля боя.
There were huge losses on both sides, and in the mayhem, 6,000 Germans were taken prisoner. During the First World War, this building was used as a hospital by the Red Cross of the Imperial Russian Army. And the Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna Romanova and Princess Elena Petrovna Romanova worked here as nurses. This Russian victory is little known in France, but curiously the Russians also knew little about it for a long time. During the Soviet era, the First World War was forgotten. The communists didn't want people to remember those heroes who'd fought for their country, but also for the Tsar. Monuments to the heroes of the First World War, such as this one, only began to appear 100 years later. Unfortunately, 30 years later, Königsberg was badly damaged during the Second World War and was almost completely destroyed following massive bombardment by the British Air Force in August 1944. 480 tons of bombs were dumped on the historical center. Over 40% of the buildings were destroyed. Only the cathedral survived. In fact, it acted as a waymark for the British planes. But the German military command had prepared the city well. There were 3 rings of defense, each made up of forts and bastions. On 9th of April 1945, only 3 days after the offensive of the Soviet Union's armed forces, supported by the French-Russian Normandy Niemen Squadron, the 100,000 soldiers of the city's garrison surrendered. At the end of the war, the Potsdam Conference granted the territory to the Soviet Union. Königsberg was renamed Kaliningrad on the 4th of July 1946, before spending 45 years shrouded in mystery, as the city was strictly out of bounds to foreigners throughout the Cold War. Since 1991, it has regained its historic charm. The region, with its coast, its nature reserve on the Curonian Spit, and its battle sites, is hoping to attract tourism of all kinds.